Regarding to this statement, I personally think that ministers should be given second chances because everyone deserves that.
For me, I'm totally for the motion. I think someone should take responsibility. But also, it depends on the circumstances and the cost of the problems and the issues. But this is a good step for all the ministers to know that they shouldn't take lightly any of their jobs.
Yeah, I'm for the motion as well. I believe that we should encourage people to take responsibility and liability, especially those in higher up positions. They would be, I feel like they're role models, so if they do that, it will filter down to the youth and everyone to make sure that they take responsibility for what they do. And yeah.
Okay, contrary to Farida and also Hakim, I'm against this motion. I believe they have to take liability and responsibility for what they have done, but not to the extent of they have to resign from their positions.
You're watching Debat Awani. This time round, it's the IIUM Reaction Youth Engage Public Debate Series. This is the third installment. Today we shall debate the ministers or people who are elected who fail to resolve major issues under their purview should resign. Earlier just now you just listened to some of the vox pop of the people that we interviewed and asked them in general whether or not they think that ministers who can't resolve major issues, whether or not they should resign or otherwise. Now you can join in this debate by joining into the conversation either by tweeting to us or by WhatsApping us. There's a number coming up on the screen right now. It's 0125501 and introduce yourself to the guests here as well. Of course, the conversation, revolves around the debaters. There you go. This is where the screen is. Keep a tab on that number. You can continuously WhatsApp us on the screen on that number there, as well as use the email debatawani@astro.com.my. Joining me for this very illustrious debate and panel that we have right now are very distinguished guests, both from the senior level as well as people who have just finished their high school. On my right side proposition, we have a very distinguished lawyer joining us, Firdaus Husni. She was the former chairperson of the Bar Council Constitutional Law Committee. And to her right, we have a very young speaker, person that has just graduated high school, Nursara Hanis Salihan. She's also doing some projects leading up to the Women's International Day. Prior to this debate, I just asked her what she was doing after high school, and clearly she's done a little bit more than what I have done when I graduated high school. That is from the side proposition. From the side opposition, those that will negate this particular motion. To my left, we have a very senior individual here, Zaidel Baharuddin. He is the senior researcher for the Center of Governance and Political Studies. He is a trained engineer and has served in two ministries before this. And to his left, another distinguished young speaker, Daphne Wong Kahmun. She is part of the national team of Team Malaysia debate, going on to debate at the World's Schools Debating Championship that is coming up very soon. That's it for these illustrious debater. Right now, we just want to play a little bit of the conversation of what the motion is like. Take a look at this particular clip that we have right now. So that was the Twitter poll that we asked. As you can see, 84% suggested that they would agree that ministers should resign if they can't resolve major issues. And of course, that is just some of the comments that we got on Twitterland. And I don't know whether Twitterland is, or Twitter Jaya as they call it, is representative of the people of Malaysia. But here to support that motion, we have a young speaker, Nursara Hanis Salihan, to take the floor. Sarah, you have 5 minutes.
All right. The Prime Minister of Iceland as well as the United Kingdom resigned after a turbulence of issues that has affected their nation, namely Brexit as well as the Panama Papers. This resignation wasn't because of shame. It wasn't because it signifies their failure, but instead, it signifies the dignity as well as the respect that they have towards their own people, towards their own rakyat, as per se in Malaysia. Because they understand that the people want something else in return, that the people demand for things that are better and things that suit them as a country even more. Hence, them as a leader, they know that their responsibility is firstmost for the rakyat, for the people. Hence, they step down in spirit of wanting to comply to what their people want. Coming from side of government, we bring to you 3 burdens to prove. The first one, that the major issues has a higher possibility to be resolved once the minister who has failed to resolve that issue steps down. The second, we are going to ensure good governance happens. This happens under 2 levels of analysis. The first being the ministries will be free of complacency, as well as we believe less corruption will happen and people will focus more on meritocracy. The last burden that we carry is that we cater to the rakyat's best interests and we uphold the principles of democracy. You will hear an awful lot of this coming from my second speaker's speech. We believe that in order for this debate to progress, the opposition side carries 2 burdens themselves. The first, how they are able to protect the interest of the rakyat, and secondly, how the ministers wouldn't become complacent and somehow still upholds the righteous morale of a leader, namely integrity, accountability, bravery, as well as responsibility. Now, without further ado, let's go jump right into the motion by defining a couple of things. I have 2 definitions for you today. First, major issues. How exactly do we categorize an issue to be a major issue? This happens under 2 levels of analysis. The first, we believe that this issue must receive national attention of the people. It quakes our people to the very core and it affects them in their very nature. But secondly, we believe that a major issue impacts national policy making of that very government. The second definition I have is on the word resolve. We believe that by saying, we define resolve, the yardsticks we have to resolve is that these ministers were given the opportunity to fix that major issues, to see through a resolution for that certain major issue. However, they have failed. So to say that they deserve a second chance is something that isn't prioritized. No, thank you. It's not something that we look upon highly in today's debate. All right. So here are, in the instance where a minister actually steps down and resigns from their very portfolio, what's going to happen? We believe that their resignation must come through a public apology in which they state the cause of problem and how they have failed to do that. We believe that a public apology is necessary because the people will have heard the actual news coming from the ministers, as well as the people themselves will be educated on certain moralities that ministers, those of higher ups, carry in their daily lives. Second thing that is worthy of noting is that this debate assumes that the ministers themselves are unpopular to begin with. By unpopular, it doesn't mean you have 10 followers on Twitter, but instead your public approval rating decreases. It means the public actually no longer favors you and do not want you in your place. No, thank you. So with that said, the stance coming from our side, we believe that democracy should always hear the voices of the rakyat above all else. So a couple of arguments coming from my speech. The first, we believe that a minister must resign because they represent the true morals and principles of them being a leader under 3 levels of analysis. First, accountability. Second, bravery. And next, they are the prime example that the people must follow. I agree. Malaysia has peaked through technological, digital and architectural advancements. However, these advancements mean nothing if morality is still absent in the voices of the people. We believe that if ministers are able to push forth the idea of morality, hence the people on the ground will be able to look up to them as an example. Second, we believe that the issue at hand will have a higher rate of seeing through a solution. It will be more efficient. Why? Because now ministers are constantly under pressure to do their very best and to give their absolute all. This rejects complacency, no thank you, and it gives them a higher sense of responsibility towards the portfolio that they carry. So hence, we believe that an issue requires the working hands of many and not just the minister themselves. However, the minister is responsible and is in charge of choosing and supervising those very hands. So we believe that when you can't make things right, the right thing to do is for you to step down and listen to the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was the opening case by side proposition. And I just want to let people know that they have not shared notes between the teams. So we're going to see a little bit more of an impromptu debate currently happening right now. So what we have done just now was we've heard the side proposition supporting the motion presented by one young speaker. She was given 5 minutes to give her speech. Now we shall listen to side opposition from another young speaker, Daphne Wong. Daphne will present this side negating the motion that ministers who fail to resolve major issues under the purview should resign. Daphne, you have the floor.
Now, so under the side of opposition, we will say a few things first. The first, we will not defend corrupted individuals and ministers that take these stands. In society today, what does it look like? Do we stand ideally as Malaysians and allow corrupted ministers to continue abusing their powers? The answer is no. In the 9th of May 2018, we saw Malaysians unite together and we voted out a political party that failed to deliver for the rakyat. And we think the Malaysians ourselves, the voters, are more than capable to vote out ministers that fail to deliver and to fail to present a positive outlook towards our own countries. Whether or not politicians should remain in power needs to be a decision that is made solely by our voters and our fellow Malaysians. And this is the type of democracy that we pride ourselves in as Malaysians. Voters, because they are fully capable to vote out their politicians are more likely to fall in line with their manifestos. They're incentivized to uphold the promises that they make, which means that the argument from the side of proposition on how politicians become complacent isn't true, because politicians have an incentive to be voted in the next elections, and they will always try to make sure they deliver their promises. 2 arguments for you in this debate. The first, on how there are principal failures in democracy under the side of proposition, and the second, on how the pressure to resign will result in a downgrade of politics within Malaysia. So, under the side of opposition, we are definitely not okay with corruption. The way we will contend in this debate is to tell you, number one, why major issues are not a good metric to determine whether or not a politician has been good towards a country. But the second, we will also say how the resignation clause takes away the very essence of democracy and choice that exists within Malaysia. The first level of analysis. We believe that some politicians do have smaller amounts of success when it comes to policy making, but they are largely smaller in scale. But it doesn't mean that they do not help Malaysians or they do not benefit our society. In our Ministry of Finance, led by YB Lim Guan Eng, they convinced the cabinet to allocate funds to rubber tappers under RISDA because their income was deeply affected by the monsoon seasons. These are the kinds of small victories that all of us Malaysians enjoy. But the side of government would choose to forego the aid and help given to our fellow Malaysians just because Lim Guan Eng is unable to solve our national debt under their time frame, which they still failed to tell us how long we will have to decide and how long we will have to solve these kinds of major issues. The problem with using major issues is because it's so contingent on many other things. It's dependent on foreign markets, it's dependent on your capacity, and it's dependent on Malaysians and our consumer spending patterns. These are all things that the side of government cannot guarantee us. The key failures here are, number one, we are unable to assess the success of politicians holistically, but the second, it takes away the right for Malaysians and our voters to make the decision on whether or not our politicians are fit. The second argument, how does the pressure to resign result in the downgrade of politics in Malaysia? The policy under the side of government largely discourages people from entering into politics in the first place because everyone is so terrified of the resignation clause. Everyone is so terrified of the media outplay that would severely hurt many impressions of the politicians. This means that the quality of politics and the pool of politicians in Malaysia is likely to decrease because this is caused by the imminent pressure of playing it safe, taking up easier jobs and easier solutions, easier problems to provide solutions for. This means, under the world of side of government, it is unlikely that you have politicians taking up difficult portfolios, whereas we believe in a democracy that acknowledges the power of these politicians and their ability to help us. They need to take up complex issues and to help Malaysia as a whole. It creates an artificial ceiling on how much we can progress, which is why it is incredibly important that you side with side of opposition.
All right, thank you, Daphne. That was the opening remarks made by the side opposition. And of course, if we can summarize the opening salvos coming from both teams, the side proposition says that resolution probability will rise, there will be good governance, and this is actually in essence of democracy. The side opposition said that they won't defend corrupted ministers, and the decision to remove a minister is solely by the voters and by the electorate. Of course, removing a minister is contingent upon many other things. Those are the things that have just been said. And of course, we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll have a speech coming in from the main speakers, and each of them will have 10 minutes of speech. Before we go for a break, here's a short clip of ministers actually resigning around the world.
Only 8 months in office, Japan's Prime Minister says he's resigning, becoming the 4th Prime Minister to leave office in 4 years. In a news conference, Yukio Hatoyama said he's stepping down over his broken campaign promise to move a U.S. Marine base off the southern island of Okinawa. But Hatoyama was also facing pressure from within his own party to resign before next month's elections. The 63-year-old leader was soundly criticized for perceived indecisiveness, and his public image had taken a pounding following a political funding scandal. 2 of his aides were convicted in that scandal. Ross Simpson, The Associated Press.
Japan's Prime Minister has formally announced his resignation. It's paving the way for the country's 6th leader in 5 years. His move follows nationwide criticism of his response to the devastating earthquake and tsunami that took place in March and triggered a nuclear crisis at the Fukushima plant. The twin natural disasters claimed the lives of more than 15,000 people, with survivors complaining about the slow recovery efforts. A new leader of the ruling Democratic Party, who'll most likely become Japan's next Prime Minister, will be chosen on Monday.
テロとの戦いを継続をしていくということは極めて重要なことであり、そしてそれはまた私の約束でもありますし、国際公約でもございます。それを果たしていく上においては、むしろここは私が辞することによって局面を転換をした方が、その方が
You're watching Debat Awani, Reaction, Youth Engage, IIUM Public Debate Series, Episode 3. Of course, Debat Awani has been going on for some time now. This is the 8th episode, and here we are debating ministers who fail to resolve major issues under their purview should resign. Joining the debate is the senior debater. Here on my right, Firdaus Husni, the former chairperson of the Bar Council.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 1999, Estelle Morris, UK then Minister of State for Schools, she pledged that if the UK government by 2002 failed to meet its standard for literacy and numeracy for schools, she will then step down. Come 2002, the target was not met, she stepped down. And later in an interview, Estelle Morris was then asked why she did what she did. And she had this to say. She says, hypothetically, if she had decided not to resign, if she had decided to continue, yeah, and then if someone were to go up and ask her, well, you did say that you would resign, why didn't you? She said, if that were to happen, I couldn't answer that question and still be the sort of politician I wanted to be. Ladies and gentlemen, today is essentially what this debate is all about. What sort of politicians do we want our politician to be? What sort of ministers do we want our ministers to be? So you have heard earlier from my Prime Minister how she has set out an excellent framework of how our argument from the start of the government should be. Yeah? And she has set out on moral justification how and why ministers should resign when they fail to resolve major issues within their purview of their ministry. Yeah? Now, what I am going to do today is to present to you why this motion should stand on the basis of governance and also democracy. Yeah? Now, first and foremost, several issues that was raised by our friend from the opposition earlier. Yeah? She emphasized on elections, on voting. First and foremost, we have elections once every 4 years. Yeah, that's one. And then second, she mentioned about the fact that ministers, politicians will then make sure that they deliver their promises. But how many times do we lament the fact that once these politicians, once these ministers are voted in, you don't hear them talking even a word about their manifesto, about the promises that they say they will deliver, and about the very promises which we vote them upon. So that is one. And then second, no. And then second, she also mentioned the fact that we also have, it's also contingent on external factors, yeah? But how many times do we hear our ministers, whenever there are failures that's being reported in the news, how many times our minister will say, oh, that's not my responsibility, that's contingent on external factors, and so therefore you cannot fault me at all. How many times do we hear our minister shifting responsibility to other people, to other factors, and instead of stepping up and take responsibilities for failing to resolve issues within their own ministry?
A point of interest, ma'am.
No. And another thing to emphasize here is that we are not saying that demanding to resign is an alternative option to election. We say, yes, you know, we have an election process that is part and parcel of democracy. But in addition to that, we need to demand better accountability and better responsibility from our ministers. And how? By demanding for resignation where they fail to resolve major issues within their department. So let's now move on into my substantive argument that is on the basis of democracy and good governance. Now, we have in Malaysia the federal constitution, yeah, as the highest law of the land. And if you look in the constitution, it does not explicitly spell out the word democracy, yes? But within this provision, within the 183 articles it contains, you will see features of a democracy. For instance, in the fact that it's on us to elect among us who best to represent our interests at the parliament. And second, how our government is constituted. That is through the appointment of ministers from among the members of parliament who were elected through the electoral process. That is in essence a democratic process, and in essence, what democracy is all about. And the process that I just mentioned to you earlier is what we call the Westminster system of government, which we inherited from the British. Now, this Westminster system of government, the whole idea behind it is a responsible government. Is the idea that we want a government that is responsible and accountable to the parliament and ultimately to the people, the rakyat at large. Yeah? Yes.
Right.
I'll take
so you say that when a minister fails on certain issues, who decides when he fails? You, the media, Twitter? Who decides when he fails and he should or she should resign? Okay. We haven't heard that sort of a mechanism.
Okay, when a decision or a policy is announced, yeah, and that decision or policy will of course come with an intended target, and when that intended target is not met, and that is the yardstick of a failure or a success of a policy or decisions by a ministry. It's as simple as that, really.
Can I follow up on that?
No. And then, the whole idea, if I can continue on my main substantive, the whole idea behind this Westminster system of government, it also comes with what we call a fundamental doctrine, a fundamental convention called the doctrine of ministerial responsibility. You have the collective ministerial responsibility, you have the individual ministerial responsibility. Collective responsibility is not the focus of today's motion. It's individual responsibility. And individual responsibilities covers three broad grounds. You have the private conduct of the minister, you have the general conduct of the ministry, and thirdly, you have the acts or omissions by officials within that ministry. The motion for today concerns the second and the third ground. Now, if I can relate to you another instances, in 1982, Lord Carrington, over the crisis concerning the invasion of Falkland Island by Argentina, Lord Carrington, who was then the foreign secretary, along with two other junior ministers, resigned. And there was a huge, public outcry. There was a huge criticism. And to this, Lord Carrington said, much of this criticism is unfounded. But yes, that policy, the conduct of that policy comes from my ministry, and therefore it is right for me to step down. That is the level of responsibility. That is the extent of accountability that we should demand from our ministers, ladies and gentlemen. And further, Lord Carrington also said that in these circumstances, I do not think by staying on, I can maintain the public confidence, I can maintain the parliament, confidence of the parliament, and so therefore it is best that another person steps in and take office in the foreign ministry. What do we learn from these instances, ladies and gentlemen? First, it's the fact that at the end of the day, what is paramount is the confidence of the public. That's number one. And second, it's the fact that the office, the ministership, has to be held at the highest level, highest standards of professionalism, of integrity, of responsibility, of accountability. And thirdly, most important, it is these values that I mentioned that our minister should hold on to. It is these values, not the office themselves, ladies and gentlemen. Now, let's turn to Malaysia. What is the situation in Malaysia? There was a paper in 2006 that basically says this doctrine of individual ministerial responsibility is either weak or non-existent in Malaysia. And why is that so? Year in and year out, when you read the news, when you read the issues that's being reported, you hear issues about irregularities. Sometimes you hear misappropriation of funds. You hear about the dismal standard of performance in government services, for example. But then, when you hear these issues, do you actually hear the ministers in charge pending resignation, taking responsibility? You don't hear that. What you hear is blame shifting. What you hear are statements such as, oh yes, yeah, I did sign the documents, but beyond that documents, I don't know what I signed. Oh yes, I am in charge of road works, but that's the engineer's fault, that's the architecture fault, that's not my fault. Is this the level of politicians that we want? Is this the level of standards of ministers that we want running the country? And you see, ministers are our service providers. We pay taxes, and therefore we have the right, we are entitled to demand the best service. We are entitled to ensure that each decisions, act, policy are all made in the interest of the taxpayers, of us, of the rakyat. Yeah, and post mainline, everyone is, I I can see in everyone's face, I didn't get to vote May 9. My ballot came too late. I was in London. But when I came back, I asked everyone, how was your May 9? And what I see is this renewed sense of optimism, of hope, yeah, and of the fact that it opens up possibilities of change. But when we talk about change, we should also look at change in the expectation that we have in our minister. Because if it's the same set of faces, but if it's a new set of faces, but it's the same set of mentality, then we cannot truly call that hashtag New Malaysia or hashtag Malaysia Baru. With that, thank you.
Thank you. And I invite the main speaker of side opposition to provide a counter reply.
Members of the floor, my esteemed government keeps mentioning United Kingdom law. I don't know why. And she gave an example of a UK Minister of Education resigning after this and that. Well, I can give you another example of a UK minister. Make it a UK Prime Minister. David Cameron called for a referendum. He felt bad about it. He resigned. And now you have the Brexit mess. How is that a good thing? So, you know, there's always two sides of the coin, and I'm the better side right now, and I'm about to prove that to you. Look, here's the thing. We aren't saying that ministers shouldn't resign at all. I know they say that democracy isn't spelled out in our constitution. I disagree with that. I think that's very, you know, I don't feel that's right. But what we're saying is that a minister's resignation should be based on moral values, on moral principle, and not by issues. Issues which are very objective, very difficult to gauge, and very, very difficult to determine. You know, you say that, oh, this particular minister failed to resolve this issue. Then I ask, who decides? Is it the media? Is it Twitter? Is it Facebook polls? Is it her? We didn't get an answer from my point of view just now. You know, so it's very, very difficult to do that. But let's just say a minister is embroiled in a scandal, embroiled in a corruption case. It's ironic a bit, but you know, he should resign. She should resign. In fact, they should be fired. There's no argument about that, but not based on issue. And I give you an example. Why is it so difficult? Now, I'm going to give you a Malaysian example. Take the Minister of Domestic Trade. If we were to go by issue, the main issue of the Minister of Domestic Trade is two things: cost of living. The other one is prices of goods. And I add the third one, pump prices, fuel. Everyone likes cheap fuel, right? If you were to judge his performance on issues that happened in December, I'm going to tell you the price of fishes, vegetable, is expensive on December. Fuel prices are usually high in December if you do the floating system. And so his cost of living will go up. But if you gauge his performance in April, he has a very good performance because prices of vegetables, fuel prices are down, and also fresh goods are usually cheaper in April than of December. Now, is it why? Simple, because December you have monsoon. Naturally, cost of living, goods are low in December. And in April, on the other hand, when the demand of fuel is lower in the northern hemisphere because of the winter, of course he will be better. The performance gauge on issue is better. So by that, why is it so difficult for us to judge when we say they should resign because of issue? Who is to judge? What is the timeline? What is the objectivity in this? And from the 10 minutes and the 5 minutes we've heard, there's no mechanism out of it. A simple question. Oh, I think the minister should resign. I don't like the person. Have to resign? Who's the majority? Aren't we taking the power from the silent majority? So when you say that a minister should resign because he or she is not performing, and where do you base on debate upon? Is it the media? See, the problem with that, and I want to push the idea of silent majority and why we really think that electoral or elections are the best way to decide, is because those who are the loudest are not necessarily the majority. Just because Twitter does not like one particular minister doesn't mean the majority doesn't like that minister. Doesn't mean his constituency doesn't like that person. And when you put a motion that, no, he should resign because he failed on the certain issue, then I ask, how do you gauge that? Isn't by forcing that, by having a trial on the media, by playing sentiment, by being politics, by taking quotations or taking his sentence out of context and then force the said person to resign. Now, aren't you robbing the rights of his constituents who decided, no, this is our Wakil Rakyat, this is our representative to the parliament, this is who we want the parliament, aren't you then robbing the rights from them? Oh, thank you.
Yeah, we got one from there.
There's one fan.
One fan.
Okay,
yeah,
So that's the thing. We say go to the ballot. You see, the problem with this, right? Now the TV showed a lot of resignation. They show a lot of Japan. And one of the example that they show was Shinzo Abe. Now, here is why when you resign by resignation, though it sounds noble, may not necessarily be a good thing per se. I'll give you an example, right? Number one, issues are very... first, I go this. If we were to go by issues per se, and we compare by timeline, here's the problem. You know, half of the ministers in cabinet today will have to resign. When you compare the PTPTN, fuel prices, cost of living, in 2 minutes' time, cost of living, and etc., and also the Prime Minister election, half of the cabinet has to resign. But even I and you know that this doesn't make sense. Why? Because a policy takes a timeline. That's why we have elections every between 4 to 5 years. Depends on the Prime Minister. If you look at Barack Obama approval rating, American president's approval rating, their approval rating will always drop after the first year in office. And why? Because that's when the tough issues and the tough policy has to be implemented. And if you were to go by simple, without any gauge, without any reasoning on why, and just simply goes on issue which is very very subjective, it's very difficult. I'll take your point of view.
All right. Now, what about in a situation where the ministers themselves set the target and also they themselves set the timeline, and that timeline and target was not met?
It's up to them. Look, I'm not putting a law that, no, you cannot resign ever. No, it's up to you. But I'm against the motion that simply say that when a minister failed to solve a certain major issues without any mechanism, without any gauge manner, without telling me how are you going to do it, I'm going to go against it. Look, we're not saying that ministers shouldn't resign ever. We live in a democracy. This is not a dictatorship. No one is arguing about that. But I have failed to hear any good mechanisms about it. Now, back to the example where just now Shinzo Abe and the Japanese Prime Minister. Look, the problem with resignations and by going politicking little by little, you know, Japan is known to have 4 or 5 prime ministers in 2 years' time. And policies take time, you know. And one of the biggest problems in the Japanese economy was that there is no certainty in the long-term planning, which is why when you see the video clip just now of Shinzo Abe resigning, what they didn't show is that now Shinzo Abe is the prime minister. And he's the longest-serving prime minister to date. I can't remember, I think since the 80s. And what does tell you is that Japanese themselves are tired of ministers resigning over every little and small things. And so that's why I say this motion is not necessarily a good thing. Now, we've heard a failure based on, we've not heard any sort of mechanism that the government is proposing. We don't even hear any solid argument on why they feel it's so. Simply by giving examples of how a minister to conduct morally and such, I don't think that's a strong case enough. I know we all love by saying that, of course, ministers who doesn't perform and they have to resign, this and that. Without any perfect timeline, it's a very difficult thing. Ladies and gentlemen, while we believe that ministers should uphold the moral values that are put upon them, and they should, you know, say what they say they're going to do, keep their election promises, although sometimes, as you know, politicians, biar no harapan, apparently it's the same thing. But in the end, what I believe is that the cabinet needs a proper timeline. And that resignation must be based on moral reasons. And most importantly, that it has to be decided on the ballot box. I believe so. And that when it's proper for a whole cabinet to run through, it's through an election cycle. So here we are, standing against the motion of the government, because one, we believe that issues are very subjective, they're very difficult to gauge. Two, we haven't heard any sort of mechanism or way to gauge on how a minister is performing or who decides a minister should resign or not. Three, you know, if anything, those who decide whether a minister should resign or replace should be the prime minister, shouldn't be the media, shouldn't be whatever. And four, if they were to resign, it has to be mostly by moral values, and when they are no longer in command of any moral virtue or moral standing, to uphold that post that they keep. And number five, most important of all, is that the decision to keep a politician in power or not should be rested upon you, should be rested upon the voters, should be rested upon the silent majority. and not let this trivia of media circus, of social media sentiments be the deciding factor of whether a minister performs or do not. And that's why me and my esteemed colleague stand here opposed against their motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zaidel. And that was it, the comments coming in from side opposition. And as I promised viewers at home, you can join this debate. We're going to go for a short break very shortly, but you can WhatsApp us your questions at 012-5501-501. Of course, we're also going to be opening the questions to the floor, the audience in the studio with me. All that is coming up right after this break. And Zaidel, I just want to let you know, we have a clip of David Cameron resigning.
All right.
Catch you after the break.
I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination. This is not a decision I've taken lightly, but I do believe it's in the national interest to have a period of stability and then the new leadership required. There is no need for a precise timetable today, but in my view, we should aim to have a new Prime Minister in place by the start of the Conservative Party conference in October.
You're watching Debat Awani, Reaction Youth Engage IIUM Public Debate Series. This is the third installment. Today we're debating ministers who fail to resolve major issues under their purview should resign. And as promised, I have opened the questions to the viewers at home, pardon my slip of tongue, and we have a few questions. We have one question coming in to the side opposition. Zaidel and Daphne, maybe either one of you can pick up this question. Politicians often make promises during the campaigns to persuade the rakyat to vote for them. In cases in which they fail to fulfill those promises, which are likely to be major issues anyway, why should they stay in office? Zaidel, you have about 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's a good question. Why should they stay in office? In fact, I've been asking that question quite a bit as well. Put it this way. If they fail to deliver promises, right? Number one, it's very difficult to gauge. I'll give an example. We were told that when the Pakatan Harapan government wins, tolls would be abolished, PTPTN or education would be free, and a bunch of other things. Really, really good things, which didn't happen anyway, except for the abolishment of GST, which I think is a huge mistake. But here's the thing. Number one, a majority of Malaysians don't agree with that sentiment that they should resign, because it's an issue of continuity of policy. And second of all, we must understand why people voted that way in the 9th of May. It's not really about issues. It's actually more of a moral standing. They believe, and I'm probably going to be very unpopular after this for saying this in my circles, is that the reason why the previous Prime Minister lost wasn't really because of GST, wasn't really because of taxes. These are the outlying, but because they believe that he, whether he agrees or not, have lost the moral standing to fill in that office, to be the Prime Minister. And that's why they voted against him. Now, how about you? Now, you have an electoral, you see, I feel cheated because I really wanted that free education and petrol is about RM1.50 per litre. Fine. Well, this is my advice to you. Don't vote for them again. As simple as that. Simply having a trial by media and simply saying that, oh, this and that, and these people should resign because they feel here. There's an issue of, number one, we must understand the real gauge of the public, whether everyone agrees with majority or not.
That's right.
And second of all, the continuation of policy. But you, as a voter, can be smart enough.
All right, I have another question from side proposition. In the event that a minister is forced to implement a policy contrary to popular opinion, for pragmatic reasons, wouldn't it be against the principles of morality for them to resign, considering that they are just carrying out their responsibility as those in power?
Okay. Now, this whole idea, thank you for that question. Now, this whole idea of accountability and responsibility, it's not just about resigning. Oh, you are unpopular, you resign. No. And if you look at our mechanism set out earlier, the whole idea comes with the duty to inform, comes with the duty to explain And in a situation where they did fail, it also comes with the duty to apologize and then take action to resolve. And if that fails, what we are proposing here is for them to resign. And so if, as the question set out earlier, if it is for the benefit of the rakyat, then it is for the minister in charge to properly explain and inform the voters how this is beneficial, either in the short run or in the long run. Yeah.
All right, just to continue on this conversation, you can also chime in on the side that you think will win or should win this debate. Just go on to the Twitter handle that will be on the screen right now and cast your vote there. To continue on with the conversations or questions coming in from Twitter, this question is for both of you. I make one big blunder on a major project and I have to resign. What if 90% of my voters are willing to overlook that for my 20-odd years worth of contribution? Will I lose talent on this? So those are the questions that could be taken up by either side. The question is, if I make one big blunder, one single instance, are you going to discount all my years of service there? No questions?
Definitely want to take it? Take it.
Yeah.
The side of opposition is the side that would not discount the many other small policy victories that you have. Because technically, if the voters on the ground think you did a great job and they trust in your administration and your ability to lead the country, then we're all for them staying within power. Because one small slip-up shouldn't be the reason why we change you out. Because it's true that if the people believe, then we believe that you should be the one that chooses whether or not you remain. Whereas side of proposition hasn't really told us why that's justified.
I want to give you guys a chance to respond to this question.
Well, on the side of proposition, we believe that anyone who stands behind a portfolio of a minister are able to provide small victories to a very country. But they aren't the only ones. Like, it's not mutually exclusive, you know. Just because one minister resigns from their very position because of a major issue, not just a small issue, not an everyday issue, but a major issue from our side in which we have told you it affects the majority of many and also the policy making of that very government. Hence, it is perfectly fine for them to step down because under their side, they fail to prove to us how when a minister steps down, the chances of that issue being resolved doesn't go up any higher. We believe it will go up on a higher standard. Why? Because the next person who comes replacing your portfolio will be someone who knows the pressure that they are in, will know that they carry a bigger responsibility in order for them to please the rakyat and in order for them to resolve that major issue. We believe that it is impossible for you to just be contingent upon the little victories that you make of the people because these little victories aren't mutually exclusive to only one minister per se.
Yeah, sure, go on.
You know, I'll make it simple for you. David Cameron resigned. Things were supposed to be better. Theresa May came in. Yeah, I guess they think it's better. I don't think so. So resignation is not just the answer.
Okay, I'll open the question to the floor, to the audience in the studio. Go on.
My name is Nazim Zahari. I have a question for side opposition. So some major issues are very time sensitive. For example, high prices due to maybe ineffective tax systems, for example. And every day that it is not resolved, people will face these problems. How will it, under your side, be resolved if these ministers do not resign?
Go on.
I answer this? Sure. Here's the thing. How is it resolved per se if the minister resign anyway? Because the issue is here. Now, if we talk about policy, you need to modify the policy. And when a resignation happens, it's, number one, there's an issue of timeline of whether you pass around on between a minister to another minister. So I don't think resignation is the answer per se. I'm not saying that you shouldn't resign at all, that this should be solved by any resignation. Number one, there's a time frame between 2 years to 3 years. Number two, to really see an effective policy, you need to look at a whole term. It's not just 1 year or 2 years and 3 years. And look, we already have a system, and it's we have a cabinet, we have a Westminster system. If the Prime Minister thinks that someone better could take over the place, then let that be the prerogative of the Prime Minister. What we're saying is that the media, social media, or someone else, or someone who's loud, shouldn't be the judge of deciding whether a minister should or should not be keeping his job. For us, it's very clear. It's very two people who decide that. Number one, the Prime Minister. Number two, the rakyat during elections.
All right, another question from the floor.
Hi, I'm Soila Salahuddin, and my question is to the government. So the perimeter of this debate revolves around the fact that this minister has already failed to resolve the issue. So isn't it like an honorable thing to do if you step down, like to step down once you can't resolve something, you know, under your ministry?
Yes, that is why we propose, and that is why one of the basis of our government is that is the moral justification. Because I mean, unfortunately, we are saying yes to that, but unfortunately, if you see trends across the globe, it's usually because of pressure from the media or from the civil society organizations or from the public that that particular minister then decide to resign. Very rarely that we see ministers nowadays, they themselves on their own accord decided that they should no longer hold office, that they should resign. That is what we want to propose.
Right, I'll still open the question to the floor. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, my name is Imandinen Razadi. So today my question is to the government side, that you believe that the minister who have failed to resolve the major issue, they should resign. So my question is, how about if they fail to achieve their campaign promise, which is the manifesto that should resign immediately too?
All right, can I answer? Sure. Okay. Thank you for that question. I think this debate is basically a basis for accountability that ministers should ultimately have and should ultimately take. It is to say that once you fail the people, you must resign. So yes, if it provides a pavement or a road for other people to also resign in the name of failure to, you know, comply to whatever it is that they have promised, to comply to their job requirements, or even to comply to their rakyat on like a governmental scale, then yes, they must resign. Because this resignation is not just to say you're going to let go of whatever responsibilities that you have, because under the mechanism proposed by our side, we already told you that they were given the chance to resolve this problem, and they have to make it a public apology, you know, for them to come out clean to the people and say, this is why I'm resigning. I have failed and I am sorry. And once they do this on a public scale, what's going to happen is that the entirety of Malaysia will look up to them, will understand that it is an honorable thing to do for you to just, you know, step down and realize it is fine time for someone else who can better take my place to take my place. So, thank you.
I got a question coming in from WhatsApp. This is for the side proposition. Using the instance of the US shutdown story, where politicians are desperate to fulfill their campaign promises at the expense of the people in order for them to ensure that they get what they want, are you guys okay with ministers so-called hurting citizens and ignoring their other responsibilities just so that they don't have to resign?
Okay. Now, on whether or not they should resign on that scenario that was given, I would say at the end of the day, you should see what exactly that the voters want. Yeah, because at the end, because if through the shutdown process, what you disappoint most is the voters, then we on the side of the proposition say yes, they should resign, because whatever decision they take, be it a shutdown, be it executing a policy, and whatnot, and be it in balancing competing interests, because yes, you know, you see that's happening right now with that situation, and that is a decision that they have to take, taking into account all the consideration, and that paramount consideration has to be the voters, and if that tells you that they should resign, then they should resign.
Okay, I have a question on the floor.
Assalamualaikum, hi. I have a question for the opposition side. So, as we all know, we're going to have a general election every 5 years, right? So, do you think that waiting for elections, which is 5 years, to vote out a minister who fails to resolve issues under his purview is too long?
So, while we do concede that you have to wait 5 years for an actual vote, I think there are a lot of other factors that pressure politicians into acting according to their manifestos or acting in the interest of the public. Because number one, you're incentivized to keep up with your popularity polls, and you're incentivized to keep your public support, because most of the times, your policies are dependent on public support. Hence, you try your best to ensure that you keep up to the same level of public support, which means that the politicians naturally have an incentive to make sure they keep in line with the things that they do, or instead, they make sure that they are in line with the public opinions and the public support to have those kinds of policies.
I have one question coming in from Twitter. Just a question for the government. If a politician does not uphold their promises, is there really no extent in terms of correcting their mistakes, however small it is, and is forced to resign? If so, why?
Okay, my first response to that would be we're talking about major issues instead of, slip-ups here and there. But for me, I do think it still requires you to resign if you are no longer speaking or representing the public in their very nature. You have to, I think this question was quite similar to the one that you gave. I think it takes a minister for you to be free of corruption and for you to uphold good moral values. But you have to understand, morality isn't solely on corruption. It is also it covers things like accountability and responsibility for the people. You have to understand that it's not just a linear scale. It's a very vast issue that we're talking about here. So yes, when we request for resignation, it is not just because of sentimental outbreaks here and there, but it's because the people who are loudest are most of the time those who are affected by this.
Can I pull up?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Here's my biggest problem with the government's proposition. They say that you should only resign when there's a major issue. What is a major issue? Because a major issue is very subjective. For someone, not getting cheap as promised in the last election is a major issue for them. For the others, that's not a big issue for them.
All right.
So it's very difficult. So how do you gauge a major issue? Who do you talk to by saying, no, this is a major issue? I'll give you an example, right? Should free education a major issue for the education minister or not? How do you gauge that? Which election promises is a major issue or not?
I will now give the floor to the proposition to respond.
Okay, now let's take that example, free education. If free education was the promise on the manifesto, on the campaign manifesto, and it is on that basis that that particular politician is voted upon, then that free education is the major issue for that minister, for that ministry. And the second thing is, if that particular issue goes towards the very core or the existence or the functioning of that ministry, then, naturally that is major issue.
Okay, so who decides that? You just decide that in yourself, doesn't it? How do you know that it's a major issue for every Malaysian?
I think it speaks for the public for them to understand what exactly is a major issue. You have to understand.
So how do you gauge?
Yes, okay. Sabar, calm down. Yeah. I know you're a man, but you have to sabar. Okay, let me not be there. Okay. All right. So you have to understand. I have clarified for you 3 times already today that a major issue affects the big public, the big picture, and it affects policy making. So when you say about free education, is it a major issue? We say yes, it's a major issue if you have promised to give out free education, but you are yet to work on it. We say it is a major issue if it affects people on the ground on a daily basis. If it is something that's constantly talked about, if you see it being represented on headlines of newspapers and even on the television, then it is a major issue. We're not saying that, major issues are something that's very divided, like one group of people say this is a major issue, the next does not. We think major issues affect people on the ground just as much. And the thing about democracy, the beauty in which democracy that we practice here in Malaysia is that everyone is free to talk about it. So you have people saying it's a major issue, you have people saying it is not. But in a democracy, we often favor the bigger audience, but we do not distance ourselves or pay a blind eye to the people who are silent about that very issue. We tend to protect them on both sides equally.
All right. Okay. Let's take a question from the floor.
Sure.
Assalamualaikum. My name is Muhammad Afiq, and my question is intended for side of government. So, given that how you solve an issue is subjective and media can come in play, people can play a lot of sentiments, don't you think that at a point when reviewing one's purview, their personal life, even though this was stated inside government that they shouldn't be included, but don't you think that there is a chance that their personal life could be included into sentiments of hate? Thank you, that's all.
All right. Yeah, sure. Yes, of course. I believe at some point of that conversation, things like that will occur either way. It's sort of a natural thing for people to also play by sentiments and for you to step into the personal life of those politicians. But I think it is fair to say that when we demand for a public apology or when we demand politicians to go public, it also means they have to clarify themselves to the bigger audience, to the bigger picture. They have to engage themselves in Malaysians from every layer of society, those who support and those who are not in favor of them. This makes sense in a sense where, you know, even when people jump into conclusions or people tend to shift the blame on you for personal reasons, and so Malaysians are still smart enough for them to, you know, navigate through the way of knowing what exactly are we talking about and what exactly leads up to that problem being talked about by the basis of that problem itself.
Okay. If I can just add to that. So in a situation where, you know, sentiments are being played or, you know, things are being made personal attacks and whatnot, I think that in itself reflects the kind of societies, the level of maturity when it comes to engaging in public discourse. And that, I think, is where the minister in charge has a duty also. And that is why this whole doctrine that I mentioned earlier, it's not just about ministers stepping down. It's about accountability. It's about responsibility. Accountability is when you have to explain. Accountability is when you have to apologize and then take action to try to resolve. Responsibility is when you take responsibility for the failure that happened and you step down. So it is for the minister to make sure that they properly inform the voters. And it is through this, when we mentioned earlier about the whole argument about being a role model, it is through this that we can foster a healthy and mature democracy and discussions.
I got a question coming from side opposition. This is coming through WhatsApp. How can possibly the society get involved in determining how to hire and fire a minister when they were not involved in the placement in the first place? This question says, direct democracy doesn't apply to us. Clearly, you have to have some form of mechanism to make your form work.
Do you answer that?
I'll take it.
Okay.
Okay. So I think the first thing that happens is that a lot of people, especially after the 9th of May, has a lot of incentive to speak up in the first place. People right now in Malaysia are more empowered than ever to stand up when there's any instance of abuse or any instance of an abuse of power towards the people. Like, there are so many ways in which people can do that. People voice their opinions, they send in letters of complaints, they send in a lot of direct messages towards their, to express their opinion within the political sphere. But the problem with this debate is that the idea of authority and the idea of ensuring there's accountability doesn't really fall under this side of proposition. Because while you have ministers resigning because they fail under your side of the house, then my question is, would you also be okay with a continuous string of resignations? Like, with politicians constantly changing, you also have an inconsistent line of policies that under your side of the house, which means that it's even harder for you to solve your major issues because there's always a change in the person that's implementing those policies, especially if your beliefs and how you solve these kinds of problems differ among people, then it's even harder for you to solve these major issues, especially when you keep changing hands and keep changing the people who are supposed to help you change.
Continuity would be the order of the day. Coming in from these guys, they say that you have to take responsibility. We're coming down to a very close time frame on the Q&A segment. I'll just open maybe one or two more questions from the floor. You, sir?
So I have a question for the government. Do you agree if Malaysia becomes a country where manifestos become legally binded?
Legally binded?
Legally binding.
Interesting. Bar council individual right here. There you go. Yeah.
You want to go? I go? Because I can add. In all honesty, yes, I do believe I'll be all for it. I believe that once we make it legally binded for them to fulfill their manifestos, then it's good. Now, they wouldn't make manifestos on this blind basis of only want to win, but instead, they would make manifestos that are rational, logical, and something that they know they can achieve for the people. So it wouldn't be a false promise or sweet nothing. It will be an actual promise. I can make it better for you. Let me make it better for you.
Okay, now to add to that, with election manifesto, what we heard, when we hear about, this, campaign promises, why isn't it being fulfilled? We hear excuses, when we made that promises, it was because we want to win the election, and that's the only reason why we want to make the promises. So I'm not sure how, legally speaking, how that will work, but I would want to agree to that proposition, simply because too many times we have been let down by our members of parliament when they say that yes, I will do this if you vote for me, but when I vote for you, I will I am now suddenly not able to do this, even though you did say so with so much guts so earlier, and that cannot be the case.
Yeah, sure.
Here's my problem with legally binding, and this is where we differ on this debate. The thing is about when it's legally binding, the matter will be decided by the courts, not the people. Whereas if it's electorally binding, in other words, voters make informed decisions that you've lied about this, so I'm going to punish you, that's your choice, not by the courts. And here's my problem with that, especially when it comes to major policies like free education. You see, when you make these promises in the manifesto, the minister didn't make that promises. It's the whole party that makes the promises. Mazli didn't promise for free education. Pakatan Harapan promised for the free education. So if you were to hold on this high moral value of idealistic values of saying that, no, you should resign because blah, 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 this and that, it should be taken into account. You see, the one that has to resign isn't really Mazli, but the entire Pakatan Harapan government. And trust me, probably, politically speaking, that's probably a good thing for me. But, or keeping Mazli is better for me, actually. But here's the thing. It's not only been a year. What we're saying is that, look, we're not going to say that you shouldn't resign at all, but there has to be moral reasons if you're in a scandal or what. It's very difficult to decide what's a major policy, to whom and to what. Now, we're saying that you should decide in an electoral system. The Prime Minister should decide, saying, you know what, this minister is bringing my mojo down, my ratings down, I should fire him. I think that's the more sensible, the more objective, and it makes much, much more sense to do it in this manner.
All right. There you have it, the Q&A session. I have to eventually end the bloodshed just before we go for the break. When we come back, we will listen to the reply speeches from both sides as they conclude this debate. Remember, you can join this conversation as well. Just head on to Reaction Twitter handle that we flashed online for the continuation of this debate. Thank you, and don't go anywhere. You're watching Debat Awani, Reaction Youth Engage IIUM Public Debate Series. And finally gotten the title right for the 5th time. Here we are debating the motion ministers who fail to resolve major issues under their purview should resign. We've heard about 30 minutes of Q&A coming in from the floor and viewers at home through our WhatsApp. And the conversation now has to be drawn to a close. I therefore now invite the speaker from side opposition, Zaidel Baharuddin, to actually give the closing comments.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the floor, viewers at home, we hear the notion or the motion that was brought by the government, and a big thing that they say is about accountability. And yes, based on accountability, which is why we are against this, we like to question the accountability of the motion itself. Number one, when you say when a minister should resign, when there's a major issue that's failed to solve, who decides? Who decides that he should resign? Should there be a polling? Should there be a ballot box thing? We've never heard an actual proper mechanism of how do we gauge about this. You see, in most cases in the real world, it's mostly by pressure of the media, a certain group of society, the loudest amongst that. And that is where the danger comes in, because you don't have an actual gauge of what is the actual sentiment. Because if you were to follow by polling, Donald Trump is popular in the first year, unpopular in the second year, third year popular back, and so on and so forth. And so is Barack Obama, and so is everyone else. And that's why we have a democracy. That's why we have elections. And the fear that if we say that the sentiment of a particular, that we take about sentiment from the public, and then we give an example, let's put another example of the United States, right? They have an electoral system. Just because the majority of voters in New York, which is the majority number, doesn't like a state president, and suddenly we ask them to resign, it's not necessarily being fair to those in other states who may have less of a population, but they have the rights in their constitution to vote by through the electoral system. And that's where the accountability part comes in, which we have not heard from the government, of who decides, how do you measure, what is the timeline, what is an actual major issue. You know, you can't give just a one-liner or major issue that affects everyone. Because during election, the promise is made by the whole party, not by one said minister. Like the example I gave for free education. So you can't simply put the burden on just that. And not necessarily if you feel that this one major issue is a failure, doesn't mean the other issues you should not take account as well. You know, for example, Barack Obama failed to deliver a proper, or what he promised on the healthcare. He promised healthcare insurance for every American. It didn't work out as much as they wanted. But there are a host of other good reasons why they think that he's a good president. The economy was growing. They reformed the Wall Street and the banks. Homeowners have a better law that protects them, etc., and so on and so forth. So if you were to judge by a minister, don't judge by an issue. Number one, judge the whole cabinet because it's a collective decision. And number two, you have to put in the proper time frame in a whole holistic manner. And so our proposition is very simple. We're not saying that you shouldn't resign at all. There must be when you lose moral standing. If you're in a corruption, or you're in a major scandal, or you broke the law, of course you have to resign. It is bad if we set a precedent that just by media circus or media pressure, or social media pressure, and then we suddenly shout the minister resign. There's a problem of continuation towards policy. You don't. You see, here's the thing. Doing the right thing is never popular. You know, if you were to go by polls, the minute you float oil prices, you're not going to be popular. And then you have people calling for the head of the finance minister. And the finance minister say, oh, due for moral vigilance, resigned. And then the economy tanks down because there was no uncertainty. And when there's no certainty, you keep changing. And that's the thing. You know, I know you love seeing some ministers resign based on the poll. Obviously, you think that they should resign. But here's the thing. It's not as simple as that. It's not just a one-liner. It's a whole range about it. If you were to judge, you have to judge the entire cabinet because policies are decided in the cabinet. It's a collective decision, decision by all of the ministers and the Prime Minister. That is what a major policy really is. You know? So for instance, free education, finance, it's not a decision by the minister alone. It's a decision by the whole cabinet because it involves money and because of policy. So you need a more sound policy, a more sensible one. And the one who should decide whether the minister should say or not are you, the voters, and not this media circus or any individual on Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you. Side opposition. That concludes the case presented by the opposition bench. Here I will invite the final speech coming in from the side proposition.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, this whole idea of proposing to have the ministers resign when they fail to resolve major issues, it's not a new idea. I mentioned earlier, this is a convention that comes with the whole system, a British Westminster system of government. And I've even cited an example as far back as 1982, when ministers resign, when they feel that they can no longer maintain public confidence, parliament confidence, if they were to hold office. So this is not a new proposition, and this is part and parcel of the democratic process itself. And from the side of the opposition, they kept harping on election. But if, ladies and gentlemen, if election alone is enough, why do we still keep seeing issues concerning accountability, lack of accountability and lack of responsibilities? And why do we still see issues year in and year out, the same issues, and the relevant ministry fail to take responsibility, fail to explain and fail to take any actions? I'll give you an example. For the death in police custody. You hear year in and year out the numbers. Every year there are deaths in police custody or in the custody of other enforcement agencies. You hear cases of police shooting, and then you still see these issues being occurring every year, but you do not see the minister in charge taking responsibility, offering resignation. You hear issues concerning, for example, the discovery of death camps in Wangkilan, which exposes issues of corruption, which exposes the very serious issues of human trafficking. You don't hear our minister stepping up and taking responsibility for that. At most, you probably hear we will conduct study on this, and then 6 months down the road, 1 year, 2 years, you don't hear anything. And that is what we don't want, because we as voters deserve better. Now, among other issues that was raised by the side of the oppositions, they mentioned what about external factors. We are saying that we are not to discount external factors at all. Yes, everything, and when you look at the market, and it's not just in the economic sense. Everything is so globalized now that you cannot look at things in its local context alone. Yes, we agree. But that is, again, on the government, on the ministers to explain properly and why that particular decision has to be taken, for example. Yeah, because the whole idea of responsibility is not just about resignation. And as my Prime Minister said out earlier, the whole, in our mechanism, you want our ministers to be able to first be given the chance to remedy the situation, to explain the situation, and where they fail, we want them to resign. That is the mechanism which we have set up at the beginning of this case. And also the opposition mentioned, how do we gauge failure? We mentioned, if it is in the campaign promises, and usually these policies, this decision will have their timeline, will have their intended target. And if this target are not met, what more gauge that you want for the fact that you have failed to deliver to the voters, yeah? And if we were to say, let's just leave it to the voters for the next, after 4 years, and what does that promote? It promotes complacency. And there is no pressure on our ministers to perform to the highest level. We always hear about the dismal performance of government servants. And this is because the minister in charge failed to see their role as the ultimate manager, as the ultimate supervisor of their own ministry. Yeah. So what we have proven to you throughout our argument is that we have shown to you the mechanism, we have shown to you the moral justification. You want your citizens, the voters, to be moral citizens, but you yourself don't hold yourself up in the highest moral standard possible. We want a healthy democracy, and therefore we deserve better. In a healthy democracy, the voters can demand better service. That in itself is what democracy is all about. We want good governance, and that, when it comes to good governance, is in the adherence to the principle that a government, that ministers in the government must account for and is accountable to the parliament and ultimately the population at large. And on this basis, in this new Malaysia, we deserve better. When we say we want a new Malaysia, we want a new government, we want a new and heightened expectation that that our ministers will perform what they say they will do. And that on that basis, the proposition case rests. Thank you.
Right, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, from both sides of the House. And of course, you can cast your vote, and after hearing the sound arguments coming in from the speakers in the studio, just head on to @reaction1 Twitter handle, cast your vote there, and you can actually have a long time to actually vote, because I think they opened this vote for 24 hours. Again, the Twitter handle is @reaction1, and for those that don't have Twitter yet, perhaps it's a good time for you to sign up to have a Twitter account. And of course, the conversation that is happening right now at the various levels of debating scene in Malaysia is actually one that is quite outstanding. In fact, our Prime Minister, Tun Dr. Mahathir, was the first Prime Minister to actually was invited to Oxford and to give a speech at Oxford Union, one of the world's, if not the world's oldest debating institution. It was aired here live on Astro Awani. We're going to be airing some repeats there. And the purpose of this is not about the natural occurrence of us debating amongst one another. It's actually about trying to engage and inculcate the culture of debating amongst our people. And it's never about getting into personal attacks or getting into sentimental or emotional arguments. It's actually trying to reason out individuals accordingly and start to line up the arguments in a very rational manner. And this is where people from various parties try to ensure that the conversation of having a good debating or healthy standards is continued across various levels. One of the parties involved is the International Islamic University of Malaysia, or IIUM, my alma mater, and through their unit, IWAN, or the debating unit there, they are currently engaging with a lot of parties, including here at Astro AWANI, as well as the Ministry of Youth and Sports. And hence we came up with this debate series called the Reaction Youth Engage IIUM debate, public debate series together with the Ministry of Youth and Sports, as well as Astro AWANI, because we want to hear voices from a rational place. And this is where we provide the safe and necessary playground for us to debate in. Of course, Debat AWANI is a show that is currently airing every Sunday at 5 p.m. to encourage people to debate, to encourage people to listen to us and watch how debate happens, and perhaps we can include some of the more rational arguments instead of becoming more of a troll on Twitter that I so personally suffer from. And that basically concludes this round of debate on the ministers who failed to resolve major issues under their purview should resign. Again, you can cast your vote based on the debate proceedings that has just taken place here at Reaction Youth 1 on Twitter. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Give a round of applause for our speakers, the young speakers, Sarah, Hani Salihin, Firdaus Husni, and side opposition, Zaidel Baharuddin, and of course, Daphne Wong. Again, thank you very much for coming, and thank you again. Don't forget to catch us next time, next week, when we have another round of Debat AWANI. It's great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.